Okay, now we want to write the test around this event binding. So I want to get a reference to this DOM element, to this icon, and click it, and then I want to ensure that total votes is increased. Now, before we write this test, let's have a quick look at the implementation of this component. So voter.ts. So here's our upvote method. In the last section, we wrote 4 unit tests for this method. So if I've upvoted, the total votes is not going to be increased, and this component is not going to raise a change event. Otherwise, the total votes should be increased, and this component should raise an event. So we tested all these execution paths using a few unit tests. Now, in this lecture, we just want to focus on the integration of this component and its template. So we're not going to repeat all these 4 execution paths in our integration tests. They're already covered by our unit tests. So as long as we click this element and then the total votes is increased, we can ensure that this component is integrated with this template properly. So back to our spec file, it should increase total votes when I click the upvote button. Okay, now similar to the last lecture, we want to get a reference to this DOM element. So fixture.debugElement.query by CSS, and here's our class, glyph icon, menu, up. Now we store this in a variable called button. Now here we need to explicitly click this button. So we call button.trigger event handler. The first argument to this method is the name of our event, in this case, click. And the second argument is an object that represents additional data about the event. In this case, we don't need an event object because clicking a button does not involve any additional data. So we pass null here. So we click the button, and now let's do our assertion. So expect component.total votes to be 1. Now here I'm writing this assertion directly against this component's property. Another way is to write that assertion against this span here. But I personally find this redundant because earlier we wrote a test that asserted this component can render total votes in this element. So there is no need to repeat this again. This is a simpler implementation. If I wanted to write my assertion against that span element, I had to use fixture.debugElement.query, and that's very noisy, and it doesn't add any extra value. So always make sure to keep your tests clean and maintainable. Treat them the same as the production code. Now, before we move on to the next lecture, a question you might have is how to organize unit and integration tests. You have 2 choices here. You can write all these tests in the same spec file here. So currently here we have 3 integration tests. In the last lecture, we wrote a few unit tests for this component. We could simply put those unit tests here, and in those unit tests, instead of triggering the click event, you would simply call component.upvote, just like that. So most of our tests would work directly with the component, and a few of them would work with the DOM elements to ensure that property and event bindings are set up properly. So this is one approach, but I personally don't like this approach because then I have to go up and down in this file to see if I have written enough integration tests for this component. And this is something that we cannot get a report of using the coverage tool that comes with Angular CLI. So I personally like to have all the integration tests in the standard spec file that is auto-generated here. So let me delete this. All our tests in this file are going to be integration tests. And then I would like to have a separate file here and call it voter.component.unit.spec.ts. So I write all my unit tests here and then a few integration tests in the other file. This way I can easily see what parts I have covered and what parts I haven't. All right, so that's all about testing property and event bindings. Next, we're going to look at how to deal with dependencies.